Hi, folks. This week we're going to talk a little bit about perspective and how to do perspective in traditional forms without 3D. The understanding of common terminology is going to be important for you as you develop your work, whether you're using this in 2D or 3D. So, when we talk about perspective, what we're talking about is the diminishing shape of objects as they recede from us. So we start with a horizon line. You should always draw a horizon line in your storyboards. You should always have at least this to place the scene and sort of ground the scene. When we look up, the horizon line actually drops down on the composition. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but you should always remember when you're looking up at the sky, you're going to see more of that sky when the horizon line is lower. Conversely, when the horizon line is up higher on the composition, that means we're looking down. And so we're seeing more of the ground than we are of the sky. Now we can tilt right with a little Dutch angle and our horizon line angles, and we can tilt left and the horizon line slopes down on the composition. What we need to understand is that on that horizon line is a vanishing point. So if we draw a box in space right in front of us, the vanishing point is typically like right on that horizon line. So if we have a box that is perfectly flat and we're drawing it orthogonally, what we don't see is the vanishing point of that box. We're only seeing this front face. But if we were to look through that box in perspective, we would see that 1 point perspective. And the 1 point perspective is because these objects vanishing towards a single point on its horizon line. That box, basically all of these lines are tapering to that single vanishing point. Now, regardless of where we draw that box, that point is going to, in 1 point perspective, diminish to that single vanishing point. So, with 1 point perspective, these parallel lines along the edge of this box and this box are going to vanish to shared vanishing points. These are parallel to the composition frame or the picture frame, right? That's what makes it 1 point perspective, is because these aren't vanishing at all, but only these parallel points are vanishing. So let's look at some examples of 1 point perspective. So if we look down a hallway and we're right in the center of the hallway, we can see what's essentially 1 point perspective. These doorways, the vertical frames are almost aligned with the image frame itself, but the horizontals are converging to a vanishing point. And that vanishing point, because we're nearer to the floor here, is going to be like right here, right? So we bring that vanishing point in, and that is where the horizon line would be. That's essentially 1 point perspective. We can do that in nature. We can position, if we're taking a photograph, we can take a photo of a vanishing point that is center. So we accentuate that 1 point perspective. And we can see this in some movies. So here is an example of High Noon. So that leads us to 2-point perspective. So in 2-point, now we have 2 vanishing points, right? So we've rotated our cube in space, and now these shapes are now are vanishing to a single vanishing point, right? The verticals are still parallel to the edge of the picture frame, but these parallels are diminishing to a vanishing point. And we can tell this based on where the object is on the horizon. Maybe it's above the horizon or below the horizon, but the parallel edges are converging to a shared vanishing point on that surface, right? So, and sometimes we're further away from an object, and maybe the object splits the horizon line, like it's sitting a little bit above and a little bit below, and this is where our drawing gets really subtle. So we have to, whenever objects are close to the horizon line, that vanishing point gets flatter and flatter and more subtle. But this is what will throw you off most often when you're sketching. Being able to distinguish whether it's above or below its vanishing point and horizon line. So multiple objects can have multiple vanishing points, right? So this cube, its vanishing point is over here because it's rotated a little bit in space, and this cube has separate vanishing points because it's rotated in space over here. But again, the vertical lines tend to be consistent in a 2-point perspective, so they're still parallel with the picture frame. So here's some examples of 2-point perspective. So if we look at an image of a building where the verticals are still relatively parallel and perfectly vertical to the picture frame, that is 2-point perspective. This is a perfect example of that, where these are running across and they're going to their vanishing points. The vanishing points here are well off the image, but they still are on the horizon line. This is an exaggerated version of this. You'll see this a lot in architectural illustration and architectural photography, where they've actually distorted this image so that the verticals still stay parallel to the picture frame, and it makes a really sort of distorted wide angle image. But this is a feature that's often used in architectural photography and illustration. Here's a good example of, even though this image is on a hill, the verticals are still vertical, and the parallels, the roof lines and the window lines and the window sills, vanish off to 2 different vanishing points. All right, now we get to 3-point perspective. 3-point perspective is when we do have a vertical that vanishes to a vanishing point. We're looking down at an object as well as sort of seeing its horizontals vanish to the horizon line. And we might be looking up at an object when the vanishing point is above the horizon as well. So let's look at some examples of this. So this is really subtle, but this is a photograph of architecture that has not been modified, and you can just see off to the sides that this vertical steel beam is not parallel to the edge frame because we're looking up a little bit at this building, right? This is an extreme example of that from a game screenshot when we're looking down at buildings and we're looking down at the street level. Now we have horizontal vanishing points for these buildings and vertical vanishing points that are well below the image but are still visible. Here's an example of sort of a 1-point perspective where we have multiple. This bridge is on its own vanishing point, and these buildings are on their own vanishing points. But if you see the side of this building tapers up a little bit because we're actually just tilting our camera up to look at the bridge a little bit, which means the sides of these buildings actually taper in 3-point perspective, just slightly. So this isn't a pure 2-point perspective, but it has 3-point perspective in it. So when we look at this, we look at a normal camera lens, and the vanishing points are much more subtle than we would draw them. So if you see, these vanishing points would be way, way far, so we can't draw them on our paper. But that's what makes our perspective really subtle. All right, so those are the terminologies that I want you to know, even if you're using 3D models, to understand the composition that you're using. So that's 1, 2, and 3-point perspective in a nutshell. Okay, so be well, stay inspired, and I will see you next time.